What's up guys, today I'm going to show you how to make a drop down with React. This is going to be the final product. Pretty simple looking. We've got a little indicator of it being toggled. When you select something, all I've got here is a pretty much blank React app that I've created with Vite. All I've done is I've cleared everything out of the the app.js, added a main tag, added a navbar component. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a drop down component. I'm going to add a folder in my components folder called Dropdown, and in that I'm going to add two files, dropdown.jsx, dropdown.css. I'm going to use the way that I do that is this extension on VS Code called ES7 plus React, Redux, React Native snippets. Very handy. First thing I'm going to do is give this outer one a class of dropdown, and inside this div I'm going to add a button. We'll just write toggle for now, and I'm going to give it a class of toggle. Now I will import useState for the toggle state, whether or not the dropdown's toggled on or off. I'm going to set it to a default value of false. And then I'm going to make just an array of options for the dropdown. And so I've got a variable called dropdown options, and it's an array of 4 objects, each object having a ID, a unique ID, a label, and a value. The label, of course, will be what will be shown on the button, and the value, I'm not using it in this example, but most apps you'll have a value that the dropdown will need to send somewhere that will not be the exact same as the label that is shown to the user. So let's go ahead and render these to the page. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. First, I need to bring in this dropdown to the app.js so we can actually see it. Dropdown. Okay, so we got our toggle. Now let's render these buttons out. I'm gonna bring in a div, and in this div, I'm going to give it the class name of options. I'm going to map over, so I'm going to loop over dropdown options, our array right here. A callback function, we have a callback function here, and each iteration will give us back one of these objects in this array. We get an option and a second parameter that we have that you don't need to use in every scenario, but with JSX in React, the element needs a key property or a key attribute. So we're going to have an index, that you can call this a key index, whatever. All it is whatever index you are in that array that you're mapping through. So here we're going to return a button. This button is going to have the value that the user sees will be the label of each of these objects. So in this case, it'll be option.label. Okay, so now we have all of our options rendering to buttons on the DOM. Now we're going to add a little bit of state to this. So we have our dropdown toggled. So on our toggle button right here, we're going to add an onClick event. And in this, we've got a callback function. What we're going to do is set dropdown toggled to whatever it is not. So we're going to do the set dropdown toggled to the opposite of the current dropdown toggled state. And now give it a dynamic class that will determine if it's visible or not. So how we're going to do this is we're going to wrap this options string, this options class, around with curly brackets and backticks, and then delete these single quotes. And after the options, we're going to add a string template, curly brackets and a $sign. And in this, we're going to have a ternary function, dropdown toggled. If dropdown is toggled, then add the class called visible. If dropdown toggled is false, then add nothing. So we can see this working if we open inspect, hover over the dropdown div, open up the dropdown. When I click toggle, if you look right here, this options div, you're going to see a visible class be added to that. And we're going to reference that in our CSS actually right now, we can do that right now. So our dropdown has a class of dropdown. If you guys are curious about any of this stuff, please let me know. And then we've got our, the div that houses these buttons right here has a class of options right here. And for that, we're gonna add this. We're gonna add the visible class to our options, which, if you'll notice, by default, our options have a visibility of hidden and an opacity of 0. So right now I'm actually not importing my CSS, so let's go ahead and do that. CSS. Okay, so by default, you'll notice that our options don't show up, and that's because of this opacity 0 and visibility hidden. But when we add the visible class, we will change the opacity and visibility to 1 and visible, a little bit of styling. So we've got our toggle and each of the buttons. So each of these, toggle is this, and just some random states. So the button, when you click this, obviously it closes, but in most cases, you're gonna want the dropdown to also close when you click away from it. So if I click outside the dropdown right here, you also want it to close. So how we're gonna do that is we're gonna bring in the use effect hook from React and also the use ref hook from React. This handles side effects. This handles references to the DOM. So under this use state, I'm going to create a new ref called dropdown ref and set that equal to the use ref hook and give it a default value of null. I need to give my dropdown an HTML attribute called ref. We set that equal to the result from use ref. Ref equals dropdown ref, which I've created up here. And with this, I'm going to use the use effect hook. And in this, we have a callback function. It's going to have an arrow function, no dependency array. So you don't need to worry about that second argument. And in this, I'm going to have an if statement to make sure that this dropdown ref actually has a reference to something, to an element. So dropdown ref, there's a property called current, which actually points to the element itself, so you can see. So if I console log this, I have, if you look down here, hopefully you can see that. I'll zoom in a little bit. We have just our div, our dropdown div. So in this if statement, we're gonna do another if statement that says, oh, hold on, I missed something. So we're actually gonna have a function, and you can call this whatever you want. I usually call them handlers. This will be passed an event. I'll show you why in a second. We're gonna move this if statement inside this function. This handler function, we're gonna pass into the add event listener method on the document. And we'll do that by doing this document.add event listener. And this is gonna be a click event. We don't necessarily need to in this context, but you'll probably wanna add this cleanup function that removes the event listener on the dismount of your component in case you wanna switch pages or something. So we're gonna do return a function that removes the event listener, click. It's got to be the same event type and the same function. It's got to point to the exact same function. You can't write this as an anonymous function. You have to have a named function and reference it in both places for this to actually remove the event listener. So anyways, so first we check to make sure this ref has something connected to it. And then if our reference that we've created contains what we've clicked, and we're actually going to check if it does not. So if it does not, that's what this exclamation mark means. It's just the opposite of if what we've clicked is not contained in the reference that we've made, we need to set dropdown toggled to false. Assuming this works, if we click somewhere in here, and this doesn't have functionality yet, but it will. If we click somewhere in here, it will not go away, but if we click away from the dropdown, it will. I don't know why I don't have a hover state on these buttons. Oh, I forgot a little bit of CSS. I just forgot. So dropdown options, button, hover. So now we should get a little bit of a hover. All right, so now let's add a new piece of state that keeps track of what we've selected in the dropdown. We're gonna call this selected option. So const selected option, set selected option, and set that equal to use state, and the default state is null. So how we're going to do this is in where we're looping through our drop-down options and we're rendering out the buttons, we're going to add an on-click handler to each button. And we're going to do two things here. First, we're going to set the selected option to the option that is currently in the iteration of the map. So we're just going to set it to option. And we're also going to set drop-down toggled to false. So when you select an option, the drop-down closes. Now we're going to render in the toggle. So in this, if you've chosen something, we're going to render the label of that option. And if you haven't chosen something, if selected option is null, then just write toggles. So how we're going to do this, we're going to have a ternary. Actually, we're going to wrap this in a span. And we're going to say, this is going to be a ternary. We're going to say selected option. So if selected option is not null, or if it exists, we're going to render the label of that option. And if it's null, if selected option is null, we're going to write select car. If I open this drop down and I select something, that selection will be shown up in this toggle. Usually you like to have something that indicates this is a drop down, so the reason I put spans here is to separate them. But I'm going to add another span here. If drop down toggled is true, we're going to render a minus, plus and minus. So here's the result. Nice and clean, makes it obvious that it's some kind of drop down. Okay, so now I'm going to add a class on each of these buttons. When you selected one, I'm going to make it obvious that that's the one that's selected when you have it opened. I'm going to add a class to each of these buttons, curly brackets, backticks, and then a string template. If the ID of the one that you've selected is equal, we're going to add the selected class. And if not, add nothing. I think the CSS is there already. So yeah, so since Mustang is selected, WRX, Miata. Fun fact, I have a Miata, it's awesome, highly recommend. Well, that's about it. If you liked the video, if you found it useful, let me know. Any feedback is appreciated, good or bad. I'm open to anything. If you like the video, subscribe. Thanks for watching. Peace.